you so much for joining us in our Coping as a Community here at the UC Davis Health System. Today we have Dr. Sheetal Shah, who is a clinical psychologist and is going to be joining us today, and she's going to give a little bit more background on herself and her professional work, and we are so lucky to have her join us. I'm going to take a second to share my screen so that we can all see some slides. At the end of the program, we're going to also, not only at the end, but during the program, we're also going to share some resource links for everyone that would want more information. We are going to be muting everyone, and then we will open up the chat box probably about 15 minutes in. So if you have any questions, be thinking about those so that we can populate that into the session. So just give me a second as I share my screen. And there we go. So I just wanted to give a little bit of context to today's session. On May 5th, 2020 of this year, Dr. Hendry Tan, Associate Vice Chancellor for UC Davis Health Office for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, put out a call against hate. Currently, during the pandemic, we had over 1,500 reports of harassment, discrimination, and assault on our Asian community across here in California. With that, we had also sent out a handout, which I am going to pull up right here. Coronavirus doesn't discriminate, and neither should we. We want to stand with our Asian American community against hate. We also are going to make this as a resource for everyone to have as a reference so that we understand what discrimination, what hate is, what a hate crime looks like, in addition to additional resources on here and the resources that we'll give today. So I just wanted to preface that for our attendees, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Shah, who's going to be talking about bystander and upstanders, and really trying to give us some skills that we can walk away with during this pandemic, in addition to the other pandemic of hate, violence, racism, and all these other challenges that we face as a community. Dr. Shah, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Mercedes.
And so, can you give us a little bit of background on yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I currently work at the Academic and Staff Assistance Program at the UC Davis Health campus. I'm partnered to work with our Graduate Medical Education, so the GME, and I work with our residents and fellows. My main job currently is to provide individual therapy to folks who are seeking it, seeking support in all kinds of ways.
Sorry, if we're supposed to have everyone muted, but just in case, make sure everyone's muted, team. Thank you.
Thank you. And so my job as a psychologist is to make mental health approachable and for folks to feel like they can access services and feel support and have safe spaces to be able to explore what might be going on for them. Prior to this job, I was at the UC Davis main campus of their student health and counseling services. I was a CAN counselor, so I work with a lot of underrepresented communities, helping to destigmatize mental health.
Well, thank you so much, and such important work, and we are so lucky to have you at the health system campus. We stole you from the main campus, so that's great. And so we just want to get into some definitions on our discussion today. And so can you give us just the definition of what a bystander and upstander is?
Yes, absolutely. And before we go into that, I want to just make sure that we're considerate of We are seeing a rise in anti-Asian sentiment, but I think it's also helpful to be mindful that anti-Asian sentiment is rooted in a system of racism and oppression and injustice, and it impacts so many of our communities. And we've seen the killings of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and folks dealing with anti-immigrant sentiments and xenophobia and Islamophobia and transphobia, and so all kinds of discrimination in ways that is impacting our community. So I'm glad that we're gathering as a UC community to respond in supportive ways by educating ourselves and being with each other so that we can combat the damaging effects of discrimination. So thank you for having me, and I'm hoping that we as a community just participate and find ourselves building community and becoming upstanders. So even as I say that, I know we're going to get into the definitions, but maybe we can just take a deep breath. This is hard stuff to talk about, and we might find ourselves triggered at different points. We might be reminded of ways that we face discrimination or witness it, and may be impacted by it. So I invite everyone just to take a deep breath. You might want to lower your gaze or close your eyes and just take a deep breath and be. Allow yourself to arrive to this talk, to this space. Your intention, my intention, and our intention is to learn, to be present, to be empowered. So as you take this last deep breath, let that breath serve as a reminder that you chose to come here, chose to be in community. And when you're ready, just allow yourself to focus and be here. So I'm going to assume that when we're talking about community and ways that we might witness and experience discrimination, there's a desire to want to change that oppressive environment into something that's more inclusive, safe, healthy, empowered. So what we'll focus on is ways that we can build a strong, inclusive community. So to answer your question, Mercedes, is what's the difference between being a bystander and an upstander? Let's kind of get into that. There's a lot of definitions and nuances for us to kind of understand. So the way I understand, so there's a difference between being a bystander, using bystander interventions, being an upstander, and creating upstander communities. So bystander, bystander interventions, upstander, creating upstander communities. The way I understand these nouns and adjectives is I try to ask myself, who am I in this moment? What is my call to action? And where is my energy? So who am I in this moment? What is my call to action? Where is my energy? Who, action, energy. I think it helps us kind of understand these things a little bit better. So a bystander is a person who's witnessing or observing a discriminatory event occur. A bystander can respond to the observation. They can use some kind of intervention or action, and that action can be passive, it can be active, or it can even be apathetic. The energy it takes to respond is going to vary. They have to intervene based on who they are, how safe they may feel, how safe the setting is, what the circumstances and an environment might necessitate in terms of action. So to summarize, a bystander witnesses something happen. They decide they want to intervene by utilizing bystander interventions to address some of these forms of discrimination or behaviors that might be happening. And we'll talk about what some of these bystander interventions look like a little bit later. So that's kind of bystander and bystander intervention. An upstander is defined by an individual who has a proactive awareness of what's happening in their community. And they take steps to respond. They call in others. There's kind of a preventative work that's happening so that they can create environments and communities that encourage anti-racist or anti-discriminatory behaviors and safety for the community. So this type of intervention requires a lot of constant energy. It often means that people have to be leaders. They might be met with some resistance. There might be a need to do a lot of ushering of folks kind of into doing this work and building and having allies kind of step into the role alongside of them. So to summarize that, upstanders are doing proactive work, often preventative work. They're being inclusive and supportive of community. They might use many strategies, and we'll discuss what those look like a little bit later. But But creating this discussion series, for example, is a good example of being an upstander and applying upstander community interventions. So I know that was a lot of information. So I'm just going to take a second to help us clarify it even further. So again, I'm going to be a psychologist in this moment. I'm going to have everyone take a deep breath and just join me in a quick visualization for a second, okay? So if everyone can just take a deep breath and imagine yourself at an airport. I'm assuming you all know what that, you all can recall what that looks like, an airport. The places where there's some hustle and bustle and people are constantly kind of just moving around. Recall at an airport the moving walkways. Can you just kind of picture getting on that walkway with a crowd of people all kind of moving in one direction? That walkway represents our society. Everyone on that walkway is impacted by the social systems, including racism, oppression, and discrimination. Now imagine someone's kind of rudely walking down the walkway, the moving walkway, maybe knocking into some folks along the way. This would be an example of someone committing an active racist behavior. On that walkway, there could be a bystander. A bystander might witness this racist act, see someone bumping into somebody else, for example. Bystander now has to choose how to react. They can have apathy. They can look down and just kind of mind their own business. But our hope is when we create these strong communities that there's going to be some kind of intervening that happens. So bystanders can utilize different bystander interventions. They might, in this scenario, say, hey, wait your turn, or create kind of like a block, like get in the middle of the walkway so that maybe it stops the flow of that active racist kind of coming down. They might remind people of the rules or contact airport security and say, hey, something's happening here, you might want to intervene. These bystanders are called to taking action using bystander interventions. And an upstander would be the folks on this walkway, this moving walkway, who decide that they want to prevent these discriminatory actions from occurring. So they might choose to walk in the opposite direction of the walkway. Upstanders are actively trying to change direction and encourage other people to do so as well. And it takes a lot of work to do that. Because imagine you're on this moving walkway that's like taking you down a path. You have to turn around and walk against that path actively to try to get people to try to stop that behavior and hopefully invite other folks to do it with you. So it takes a lot of work, and imagine a lot of folks walking in an opposite direction. There's no longer space for that active racist behavior to take place. So I hope that visualization kind of helps to clarify a little bit. And what I really want people to kind of visualize is imagine everyone taking an active step together in support of each other, in accordance with each other to stop that active and racist discrimination. So even on this walkway, if you can picture people linked hands, pre-COVID linked hands, and being in community, being in support, having tools and education and kind of some interventions in their pocket to be able to respond. This is an example that was set up by Beverly Daniel Tatum, and she states that unless folks are actively walking in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, they will find themselves carried along with others. I'm going to say that again. Beverly Daniel Tatum said that unless folks are actively walking in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, they will find themselves carried along with others. So we as a community don't want to be carried along. We want to create a space where we feel empowered to pave a path. We feel empowered to support each other. We feel empowered to use bystander interventions, calling in our allies, and engaging in upstander behavior. So again, as upstanders, we're going to choose, as a community of upstanders, we're going to choose to actively and consciously engage in creating this space. Does that help clarify?
It does. It does. Do you, so what I hear also is in our community, a lot of times during these situations, it just takes one person. And then the community tends to come together and rally against the challenge that is faced. And so as we've seen in media, in the news, you know, when these acts occur, we do see bystanders, but we also see when that one person takes that stance, then the community rallies around that upstander and really is supporting that person. So we're really never alone in that situation. Is that your finding also, Dr. Shah?
We can find ourselves alone, but what I want to say is that one situation is not going to be applied to all, right? You can find yourself alone, and what I would say is, if I want you to assess your risk and your safety and figure out what you can do in that moment. But as a bystander, as someone who's witnessing something that's happening, you have tools, you have ways of being able to react and step up and support. So hopefully multiple people will step up and support. Multiple people will rally and come together and use bystander interventions to become upstanders. They will feel that, who am I in this moment? I am a part of a community that wants to be safe. What is my call to action? I'm going to do what I can. Whatever is in my power, whatever tools I have, I'm going to apply it so that my call to action is, I'm going to do what I can to make this community safe. And you have to think about the energy that you have to safely kind of do that as well, right? We can, not one person can keep doing this work. We all have to keep doing that work, because that one person is going to burn out. And as a psychologist, I have to say, burnout is real. Fatigue is real. We need space and time to heal. We need to be able to make some choices. We need to be able to reflect on our process. Give ourselves some compassion for all the hindsight reflections that we're going to have and the ways that we might be triggered. So yes, I agree. One person can make a difference. Many people will make a bigger difference.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Definitely safety first.
Yes.
So, Dr. Shah, would you like to go to the slides for the bystander interventions and look at the techniques that you want to share with the attendees?
Sure. Yeah, that sounds great. So we talked about being a bystander and observing something that's happening, and I'll wait for you to put the slide up. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about being a bystander and observing, and we talked about being a bystander and having bystander intervention, so that when you observe act of discrimination happening, you can do something about it. And so this Hollaback intervention by the Hollaback org really does a great job of summarizing 5 different bystander interventions. So I'll kind of go through them, and then I'll talk about some upstander interventions. So one intervention that they talk about is distraction. And this is more of a subtle way of intervening, but essentially what we want to do is derail an incident from escalating or happening even more by interrupting it or distracting from it. So the idea here is to ignore the harasser or the person who's committing an act of discrimination and engage directly with the person who's being targeted, right? So they're not feeling alone. They know that they have some kind of support, and you helping that person just distract from whatever might be happening, and hopefully it derails this person from being the person who's committing the act of aggression from continuing. So this could include things like pretending to be lost, or asking for time, or kind of getting in the way, stepping in between the person who's being harassed and the person who is harassing, stepping in the way of the two of them. It could mean trying to change the conversation or making a joke, essentially trying to distract the situation so that the situation de-escalates. This can create a more safety in the environment, and it can show the person who is being harassed or being aggressed upon, it can show them some support, which could be very helpful. They also talk about delegating or delegation, and that's when you can ask for assistance or for a resource or help. So this might be an example might be going to a TA and saying, hey, the conversation that's happening in our classroom has really been triggering, and I want to be able to figure out how we can do this in a different way. Or asking a TA for support when you know that somebody in the classroom committed a microaggression. This might be asking a security member for support because you see something escalating. It might be talking to your manager and talking about how microaggressions are playing out in the workspace and making it unsafe for you. So delegating some responsibility and asking for assistance. It doesn't take you out of the situation, it just invites somebody else to support you in the situation. I did mention asking for security or support around security, and that's something that it's a hard conversation to have, again, because I mentioned George Floyd, and earlier I mentioned a lot of communities maybe not feeling safe in calling 911 or calling police for support. And so really wanting to assess the need to do that, and maybe the people who are in the situation, if they might feel comfortable or safe with the intervention of law enforcement. Because of historical mistrust with police intervention. So be careful as you think about doing that, but delegating and asking for assistance is a really great way of interrupting or de-escalating something that might be happening, and calling in people to help support for safety. Another intervention is documenting. So it could be really helpful to report incidents that are happening. Mercedes, earlier you mentioned that there's a rise in anti-racist sentiments against Asian Americans. The reporting of this is really important, but we also have to recognize that a lot of people aren't reporting, don't know how to report, don't know the benefits of reporting. And sometimes making sure that we know that documenting and leaving a trail of reporting is really important. It helps draw attention, it helps give research, it helps the community understand trends and what might be happening. Another way of documenting might be recording an incident as it happens. So I'm sure, again, with a lot of these news stories we've seen lately, people have been recording instances where they're receiving, or they're the recipient of discrimination, or they're seeing something happen. This is often video recording or going on some kind of social media platform. And this is always to help kind of understand and add an extra line of support to the person who might be harassed. You always want to ask the person who's harassed what they want to do with the recording after the recording has ended. We want to make sure that people have consent, because if someone doesn't have consent around what's going to happen with that recording, they might feel even more powerless. And documentation is scary, and your name is out there, your image might be out there, people might know you in the workplace, etc. So you always want to, when you're documenting and reporting or recording, you always want to make sure that you're in conversation with the person who is victimized or who might be harassed. There's also a delay. So this is where, even if you can't act in the moment, I'm sure we've all had those moments where we noticed that we were a bystander, and we noticed that there was something we could have done, but we didn't know what to do, and we kind of missed that opportunity or missed that moment. Well, there's a delay. You can always make a difference for the person who is being harassed by checking in with them, making sure that you spend some time saying, hey, how are you doing? I saw that happened. Was there a way that I can support you then? Is there a way I can support you now? Offering them company, giving them a glass of water, sharing with them resources, or finding ways that you can create some safety in the environment. Even if it's a delayed response, that response itself, that support itself is really important. And then the last thing the bystander intervention talks about is direct. So you might want to directly respond to the person who is harassing. So you directly respond to harassment by naming what's happening or confronting the harasser. This is a little bit of a more riskier situation because there's a lot more room for harassment to escalate. So you might want to just assess the situation. Are you physically safe, or are folks around you physically safe? If you directly confront someone, will the situation escalate? Can you tell the person who's being, can you ask the person who's being harassed if they want some support? But ways of doing this, a direct way of doing this would be telling someone who's causing the harassment to say, that's inappropriate, it's disrespectful, I'm not okay with that. That comment was racist. You want to try to be short, you want to try to be succinct. You don't want to escalate things, you want to directly call out a behavior that's happening and divert it from continuing to happen. So those are some bystander interventions that are that can be really helpful: distract, delegate, document, delay, and direct. A real life bystander situation happened to me that I can share, which I I'm grateful for, especially in retrospect, because I always wonder about these situations and how I could have handled it differently. But a friend of mine was visiting, and she and I went to a Sacramento Kings game, and it was Bollywood night, which is my favorite night to go to the Kings game, being South Asian myself. And she and I, after the game, were walking downtown. We were heading to our cars. And then there was a group of men who were just shouting some profane, taunting, discriminatory words toward us. During the game, there was a lot of Bollywood dancers, and so they were trying to mimic the actions of these dancers, and kept telling us to dance. And as we noticed that, I was feeling really heightened. I was feeling really nervous about being on the street and having this group of men around us, taunting us. And harassing us. And what ended up, as they were shouting about trying to get us to dance, what ended up happening is there was this other group of people, bystanders, that were just walking by. And what they ended up doing is standing in front of us and then the men, and they just started dancing and being really kind of funny and humorous, and distracting those guys that were harassing us from the situation. My friend and I just booked it out of there. We left. And in retrospect, I would have wanted to tell those guys off. But I'm also just grateful that folks intervened on our behalf, and that my friend and I felt safe and were able to kind of move forward. So that's a good real life example of how a bystander intervention could be really helpful. There's also, so then the other things that we can do are community and upstander interventions. These are interventions that help us kind of bring more awareness and are proactive. So we want to use things like calling in behavior versus calling out behavior. We want to, and that's really about relationship building. So when you notice that something doesn't feel right and there was some kind of microaggression or some kind of act that happened, can you call someone in and ask them to have more empathy and understanding about what might be happening? So instead of saying, I can't believe you said that, you're such a jerk, you might want to say, hey, when you said that, that didn't make me feel good. I was pretty uncomfortable with that. It had a direct impact on me. You're calling people into community, into relationships, asking them to think about what that might mean in the context of the relationship and how people are. Other things that people can do is educate, we can discuss, and we can raise awareness. Having trainings is really important. Using the trainings to make sure that we are creating spaces where discussions can happen, and that awareness from the training translates to the work that we're doing feels really important. Making sure that systems have policies to support the values that we have, and the UC Davis community has been really great about that, making sure that we're consistent with our principles of community. But again, in each individual department, making sure that we have policies that are really supportive of an inclusive, safe space. Other interventions are creating spaces or forums, much like this one, where we can engage in having discussion and engage in being with each other and having dialogue around being upstander and having upstander interventions, I think is really important. We can organize, and so this means organizing protests or having town halls or having discussion spaces to be active and trying to understand ways that we can support the community. So organizing is a very important upstander intervention. We want to be proactive and preventative focus, and so again, this forum is a good example of that. But how is it that we can be doing the work that helps prevent more things from escalating or more discriminatory practices from prevailing? And the last thing is we want to increase allyship, and we want to call our allies into the community to increase the work that we're all doing together. And an ally is a person in a position of privilege and power, and they seek to operate in solidarity with marginalized groups. I see it as allies seek to be in community with everybody who is with everybody, and we're all working together for a similar cause. A real life upstander intervention is one that I'm pretty proud of and humbled by watching. And I got some permission for folks to be able to use this example. But we had 2 internal med chief residents this year who have experienced their own forms of microaggression, have witnessed other microaggressions happening around them. And they decided that they wanted more information. They wanted to understand how they can make a change in the environment and understanding of ways that microaggressions can be stopped and allies can be created. So what they did is they started doing their own kind of qualitative research. They polled some folks to share some stories about microaggressions that they have encountered while in training. They put together, they spent some time analyzing the research that they came up with. They spent some time putting together resources, and they decided that they wanted to do a microaggression training. It's great. What was great is that they were in positions of power where they asked, they were able to organize it so that all residents had to come to these trainings. But what was really great is that every single resident in IM had to attend a training on microaggressions, and the training was very much based on didactic, where they got information, experiential, where they understood the qualitative research. There was a lot of dialogue, and then a lot of strategies on how folks can go out and be good bystanders and good supporters and good allies. The training came together really well, and Dr. Coy and Dr. Rangel Garcia were wonderful examples of being upstanders in our community.
Wonderful information, Dr. Shah. We've opened up the chat, and so for those who have questions, go ahead and add them. But we do have one question that I'd like to pose at this time, Dr. Shah. And Jody outlines, how about an upstander appealing to the sense of compassion and love to a group of people who are harassing others? Might this be effective? Have you found this to be effective?
Absolutely. You know, one of the questions I know that we had talked about is how do we build a healthier, safer, inclusive community? And part of doing that is being active, having active listening and being empathic, and having compassion for ourselves for what we might be going through, and compassion for others and what they might be going through. So being able to use that empathy and that compassion to build community is really important. And as you build community, that there's going to be more of a call and a buy-in and a call for action to be upstanders, so that we're all in this together. When I see a friend struggling, I want to help my friend. When I see my community struggling, I want to be a part of being in that community.
Very good. And then there's another question, which is a little bit more of a challenge. We have the question of how do we become more inclusive and tolerant of people who have different opinions, values, and an opposing stance in where they stand when they think their opinion is unjust, or when the other person thinks the opinion is unjust and wrong. For an example, this one is very controversial, but what the symbol of the Confederate flag and how that is harming to specific populations, or really our entire community, as a hate symbol.
That's a really good question and a really complex question. And I imagine that there's many ways that we can deal with it. As a psychologist, what I would say is creating spaces for folks to have dialogue and empathically listen is going to be really important. I'm not going to say that I will get on board with someone having a Confederate flag. I think that goes against what my values are. But it might be helpful for me to have a conversation to understand what that flag means to the person who holds it. But more importantly, I think it's going to be really important for that person who holds that flag to understand what impact it has on me. Having that symbol of historic racism, of systemic oppression, of ways that seeing a flag, that image makes my world, the world around me, the world around my friends, unsafe. I think I would want to emotionally and empathically be able to convey that to that person. If that person is resistant and they're not willing to engage, my hope is that what we can do, our actions in that moment, is still be able to convey that for them, but also say, maybe this is something I can't do right now, and call in allies to help you support doing that work. Maybe, for example, asking a white ally to say, hey, so-and-so has a white flag, or has a flag of the Confederate States. And I'm having a hard time knowing that this space now isn't safe. I've tried my best to convey what's happening for me and calling that person in, but I wonder if some of the white allies can step up and do this work as well.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. And I really appreciate, the whole focus, not the entire focus, but the focus of community for our health system. We're 10,000 employees strong. And so it's so important. Dr. Henry Tan, our Associate Vice Chancellor for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, is so committed to being able to create a culture and a climate of inclusion. And what does that mean? And what are the health needs for us to be an inclusive community at the health system? So we've provided community healing circles and community circles. Currently with the pandemic, we're doing these virtually, but it's something that we're going to consistently work on, and we've done for the last 2 years for both our external and internal community, are the community circles, because it really gets to the point that you are offering. And once again, thank you for your personal example that you had shared with us. But when we're in circle, we're able to hear each other's stories, and really that old adage of getting into someone else's shoes, really being able to hear that experience and the harm that it's created, and really having more of an awareness and then an intentionality for these interventions and the skill development and our own continued education in these areas.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Would you like us to go to the next slide?
Sure.
Okay, so once again, the chat is open, and we're going to start talking about healthier and safer inclusive communities. Oops, thanks, Dr. Shah. Here you go.
So I spoke about some of these, and the question is really, how do we strive to build healthier, safer, inclusive communities? One thing that we want to emphasize in our community is that we need allies. All of us have power and privilege in different ways, and we need to be able to operate in solidarity with any and all marginalized groups. So when we have an active, consistent, and arduous practice of being able to support and unlearn and reevaluate and organize and be a part of community and step up when an ally is needed, I think that's going to be very important to building a healthy, safer, and inclusive community. I mentioned active and empathic listening. The more we can understand where someone's coming from, and the more we feel understood ourselves, relationships get built. And as relationships gets built, I think there's a call to be more community oriented. We want to make sure that we're feeling inclusive and we're feeling safe and supported. And hopefully it's reciprocal, right? So that active empathic listening goes both ways. I have to mention self-care. If we are not taking care of ourselves, if we're not remembering our physical needs, our mental needs, if we're not creating spaces where we can figure out how to replenish ourselves and our spirits, it's going to be really hard to continuously do this work. Self-care can look really different. Self-care can be group-oriented, right? And so we can have healing spaces. We can go to like a group discussion. We can go on group walks, or it can be, I'm just going to take a moment for myself. I'm going to make sure that I go for a walk every day at lunch, or I have some boundaries around the things that I say yes to, or the things that I say no to. Remembering that whatever is happening in our community, the acts of discrimination, the racism, the oppression, has an impact on our body and our health. The more we can attend to those things and take care of ourselves, the healthier we're going to be as individuals, and the healthier we're going to be as a community. I think it's really important to be sincerely curious and raise our consciousness. So the more readings we can do, the more conversations we can have, the more engagement we can do, and reflections that we can have around the process, around the community, what the community needs might be, is going to be really important to raising our consciousness. We want to make sure that we're persistent with our learning, and learning can't just be, I read an article today. Learning has to be, I read an article today, and this is what this article could mean for the spaces that I'm in. It can't just be, I attended, a CEU. It means I attended a CEU, and let's have conversation around what we learned and how we can apply it to the spaces that we're in. We want to make sure that we're addressing mental health and fatigue and low morale. This work is really hard. It takes a lot from us, and we're all going to be triggered in different ways based on what's happening for us. So making sure that you might access therapy, making sure that you're accessing social support, that you're getting plenty of rest and food and exercise, making sure that you're taking breaks or you're attending to just your morale. Making sure that you have compassion for yourself and others, just taking a moment and just noticing this is really hard. This is really hard work. And I'm going to have a moment, a breath of compassion for myself and a breath of compassion for other people because they're trying and we're all trying. Know that things take time, and so does building safety and community. And things take time to forget. I think sometimes when someone commits a microaggression and there's an apology or a conversation that happens, people often think, hey, we can just move on. This is done. But know that those moments of safety last. It's a wound that needs to heal. And there needs to be time to build back up, and there needs to be time to be able to forget. Having community mindedness and being present around what is happening in the moment in ways that we can all support each other is really important. That could mean I'm going to take a break and we're all just going to meditate together. That could mean, hey, let's take a minute and have a moment of silence and be with each other when we hear about a death that happened, or when we hear about a painful instance that occurred. Try to find ways to replenish people's spirits or morale if you have the capacity to, but make sure that you're doing that for yourself as well, and maybe sometimes doing that for yourself first so that you can give to others. I like to say this one thing is don't take on the work of others, but help other folks if you can. So it's not my job to build an ally, but it's my job to help an ally create awareness. I can't just take on someone else's guilt or someone else's frustrations. That's not my work, that's their work. But if they're working and they're sincerely wanting to be curious with me, I want to be able to be curious with them in that relationship. I know we've mentioned this before, Mercedes, you mentioned it too, but we need space and time for healing to happen. And talks like this, moments like this, are reminders that we have a collective commitment. We as a community have a collective commitment to build safer, healthier, inclusive communities. And so just to remind ourselves like who we are in this moment, we're a collective community, and we have agency to act, and we have agency to use our energy to do some good work.
Wonderful, Dr. Shah. And so we are also interested in finding out the wisdom of the community that is here through this virtual presentation. We have quite a few participants, close to 100 participants with us today, and wanting to hear your feedback on what you believe is a healthy or inclusive, or both, healthy, inclusive community. What are the needs that you have personally? What are the needs that you know that would benefit your unit, your office, your department, and you yourself? So I want to pose that question to our attendees. As Dr. Shah has listed these identifiers out, which ones speak highly to you? Go ahead and put that information in the chat. We do have a couple of questions, Dr. Shah, and one in particular regarding policy and how to confront policy that is supporting brutality in the moment. How does a community come together to confront policy, or policy brutality in the moment? I'm wondering if that's spelled correctly. So to go on, although confront police brutality, police brutality in the moment. Although police should protect the community, that's not always the case, and you discussed that a bit yourself. I'm wondering how we can confront authority without further escalating. And so that's really very complex. And so as, you know, the community coming together, I think there are some strategies, community strategies, community advocacy groups throughout Sacramento area that our attendees can join and really have a larger front, because the police brutality that we've experienced across our nation and globally is extremely complex. There's a lot of structural issues, antiquated trainings on, you know, tactics, or, you know, physical tactics that are obsolete, that they continue using. And so what would be your thoughts on this question?
It's a really complex question. My first reaction is, let's see what organizations are already out there in the community doing this work, and how can we be a part of the work that's being done. I think there's a lot of really amazing organizations in Sacramento and across the U.S. that are challenging authority and challenging police brutality, and are calling for more trainings and changes in policy and changes in laws and advocacy for justice. You know, I've been reading a lot about the death of George Floyd, and this weekend it's been really just sitting on my heart in ways that folks are responding in Minneapolis. There's a lot of organizing that's happening, and the more organizing that happens, hopefully the voices get heard. But that's just one part of it. The other part of it is, how are we actively changing policy, and how are we actively calling on government officials to be able to attend and address these things as they happen. I'm not sure if there's a right answer, but I think the answer is we have to do it in multiple directions.
It's a multi-pronged approach, from grassroots to executive leadership, all the way around. It has to be attacked at many levels. And a lot of this also, you had also stressed, is relationship building. A lot of times we need to have relationships with each other, with communities, with folks that are have opposing values and views. And so it's really about that relationship, which takes a high level of emotional intelligence for us to be able to sit in communities that, you know, that are different from us, that we don't engage or interact with. Would you agree with that, Dr. Shah?
Absolutely, I would agree with that. I mean, and you know, the questions I posed earlier is, who are you in this moment, and what ability do you have to act, and what energy do you have to do those things, right? And where is your energy? I think is going to be really important. Sitting in conversation with someone who has really opposing views is very, very hard work. Who you are in that moment might determine, like, are you an ally in that moment? And is that your job? Is that the work that you should be doing, or you could be doing, that can be beneficial? So maybe that action that you take then is to really have compassion, and really have, take the space to kind of raise consciousness and empathically listen and give information and educate and do all of those things, and then notice where your energy is around that. Maybe that's your call. Maybe that's where you can put some of your energy. But if you're someone who's being harassed and you don't have the energy to take care of yourself and your community and engage in conversation with someone who won't be able to really understand you or meet you where you are, maybe the action that you take is, I'm going to take a step back, and I'm going to let them know that I'm impacted. And I'm disappointed, but maybe this is not the right time for me to engage with you, and hopefully the allies can step up.
Thank you. I love all the bullet points that you've put forth here on building the healthy communities. I'm wondering, as a call to action for our attendees, what could we possibly take one of these bullet points with us and put a plan together for action? Compassion for ourselves and others. The whole series of Coping as a Community, we really stressed the importance of the self-care. We really talked about the needs for us to engage in immune building behaviors, whether that's, you know, something as simple as exercise and eating well and sleeping well, but also also being able to enact some of our own agency for others and the community. So I'd like to put the call to action to our attendees. Could you take one bullet point on community mindfulness? Could you take that back to your unit and talk about that and see what other ideas can manifest to really have an inclusive culture and climate for each section of our health system, which we serve our broader community, and that vibration of health and wealth and care and compassion, could that be the vibration that we have out into our communities and all that we do?
Yeah.
So,
I remember a mentor of mine once saying that if everybody in the community, right, like all of us collectively, we all got together and stepped up our efforts by just 10%, we do 10% more than what we're doing right now in this exact moment. If you can step up our efforts by 10%, imagine the difference that makes. Right, so we're not saying walk away and do all of these things. All of this stuff takes time. It takes a lot of time and energy and to process and do all of these things. But I wonder if one of the commitments that we can make is, I'm going to step up my efforts to build a stronger, safer, inclusive community by 10%. I wonder what that's going to feel like for the community.
and that's so important, right? And we as a health system, and really UC Davis as a whole, through the resources that we have in human resources, we can take workshops on emotional intelligence. We can take workshops on unconscious bias and microaggressions through our office. We have the resources, but we need to find the time to ensure that we're always strengthening ourselves. That's part of our hiring package. We should be able to take those resources so that we're as well tuned to be able to take on these challenging areas, strengthen ourselves professionally, but it really strengthens ourselves personally so that we're effective in all the communities that we engage in, whether it be our families, our work communities, and what have you.
That's a really good point, because we have to go from a micro level to a macro level, right? It could be teaching that our young at home and the people that are in our families to having these large forums that we're having right now on a macro level.
Right, and our resources from human resources, they're online, they're in person when the pandemic is over, but we have so much rich resources that we could really change the culture and climate of our organization. And that's really the investment the university is making for each of our employees. So there are a few questions regarding the presentation. All of our presentations are recorded and then posted on our website. The website is on there for the Office for Health, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. You can look for the last 2 months of presentations on mindfulness and meditation. And so once again, that self-care that Dr. Shah has been talking to us about, in addition to all of our presenters, that is so crucial that we take the time to invest in ourselves so that we're better centered, healthier in body, heart, mind, and soul, so that we have a healthier climate and culture at UC Davis Health and the communities we serve. So Dr. Shah, I'm going to ask you in these last few minutes as we end, any words of inspiration for our attendees?
Step up your efforts by 10%. I think that's a really wonderful way to just say, this is my commitment. I'm going to commit 10 extra percentage of my energy to doing this work. Pick 1 or 2 of those building healthy community tips and try to see where you go with it. For me personally, the biggest thing is building relationship and having folks really focus on ways that we can support each other. Relationship building is really important to me. And then the last thing I'll say is, again, going back to those questions, asking who you are in this moment, what your call to action is, and where your energy is around doing it, around implementing action. Hopefully that the call to step up your efforts by 10% will reflect that.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Dr. Shah. We do have resources in the chat. Blake, we see your question regarding managers. I would like to offer that we are going to be hosting a session specifically for staff managers and supervisors so that they're able to have better tools for engagement with their teams and be able to have those conversations that you need to strengthen your units. So one last question someone asks is, how do you emotionally help those who are being racists? That's once again a challenging question in these last few minutes.
Really good question.
It is. Dr. Shah, do you want to offer something?
It's a really good question in that it's hard, right? You have to manage your own reactions and your own feelings as someone is actively being racist. But I, as a psychologist, know that that's coming from somewhere. And so what I would want to do is help the person who may be committing an act of racism or is emotionally kind of contemplating what that means for them, is to contextualize where they're coming from. So this is a society we live in, and these are the things that are happening, and this is what's happening in my world, and this is what's happening on the campus, right? And so help contextualize how that racism impacts us on a macro level and a micro level. I would want to help them kind of understand and have empathy around the impact that they have. Their words, their actions, their sentiments have an impact on me. So I would want to call them in and have some discussions around that. I think there's people who, I think I want to believe this, but people who who commit acts of racism and now are contemplative want to change. And so how can I give them resources? What is it that they may need to talk through or understand a little bit better on their own, and be mindful around what the ways their actions have impact? I would want them to help them unpack some of those things.
Definitely. And once again, for us that do this work, it's something that we have to check ourselves in to help others emotionally. So I always have to be in check for myself and really come from the areas of empathy and compassion, because what we know is hurting people hurt people. And as Dr. Shah had outlined, that usually these actions are coming from a place that's much deeper than what we're seeing. And so being able to help those with that perspective, because that's the answer that tends to come up the most, is we have to have compassion for everyone in these violent situations and these hurtful situations. But once again, we're providing space through this forum. We also provide space through our circle practices. And so that's what we'll offer for our attendees. We offer those circle practices for our UC Davis Health community. And in addition to, we also include our external community. And so Karen has a question about drawing others in that are, hard to get to, who have English as second learning challenges, social justice populations. And Karen, let's have an offline conversation about that, because in these final minutes, we need to wrap up. Thank you once again. We've put some resources in the chat box. We will also add these resources at the end of the survey that we will send everyone. We encourage everyone, please fill the survey out. That helps us to guide us in improving our services and being of service to each and every one of you. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Shah. This was a wonderful discussion, and thank you so much for all the work that you do for us. We're lucky to have you. Thank you so much to our attendees for being here. Take these words and take these strategies. We will send these resources to you, and let's put them to action together. So with that being said, thank you all and take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Dr. Shah.
Bye.